Over the course of this two-part series, I will examine and discuss an interesting theory on the nature of reality, put forward by the modern philosopher Spinoza. I will primarily be looking at a writing of his entitled The Ethics, in which he argues that there can only exist one substance in the universe, that substance being God. I will briefly discuss how his views differ from those traditionally held, before launching into a full discussion of what exactly he means by substance, how God fits that definition, and why there cannot be two or more substances. But before one can properly examine Spinoza's writings, it is necessary to take a look back at his philosophical predecessors, of whom he was undoubtedly aware, in order to learn what views they held on this topic, and provide a context for Spinoza's thoughts, unique though they may be. As the British philosopher Stuart Hampshire writes in his book on Spinoza, the notion of substance has a continuous history in philosophy, from Aristotle to Descartes. Looking at the first of those, we see that in Aristotle's view, substance is something that is individual, but not exclusive. To put it more simply, his primary ousia, or primary being, is primary in the sense that it is the fundamental, or most basic element of reality. But that does not therefore rule out the existence of other substances. The modern French philosopher René Descartes, who had a clear influence on Spinoza's views, held that minds and bodies were themselves created substances, each of which had their own attributes. Thought in the case of minds, and extension in the case of bodies. Now, these metaphysical ideas of Spinoza are interesting due to the unique view which he puts forward of God and how he relates to substance and creation. In the traditional Christian understanding, God is immaterial, and he exists in separation from what he's created. Looking again at Hampshire, he puts it very neatly, explaining that the common Jewish and Christian idea of creation necessarily involves this dualism of creator distinct from creation, which Spinoza's definition of substance excludes as self-contradictory. Creation is traditionally material, and therefore it must be separate from God, who is the immaterial creator. But as modern philosophy emerges, so does a new conception of the world, requiring many ideas which were formerly accepted as self-evident to be re-examined. Hampshire writes, among the notions called for re-examination in the 17th century philosophy was the conception of the world as a plurality of substance, to be denied again by Spinoza for largely new reasons, and with a new force and emphasis. So Spinoza rejects the traditional created-creator dynamic, offering instead his own set of definitions for substance in the Ethics, and presenting them as the only possible, non-arbitrary, and consistent definitions for substance, cause, and God. In Spinoza's mind, there is no other lens through which to view the world. His definitions and axioms are the only ones logically sound. He writes, by substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that the conception of which does not require the conception of another thing from which it has to be formed. Therefore, substance, for Spinoza, is that which exists on its own, and comes into being through its own power, without any outside forces acting on it. He includes this also in his collection of axioms, as follows. That which is not conceived through another thing must be conceived through itself. I mentioned a moment ago that Spinoza was influenced by the ideas of Descartes, and that becomes clear here when the former separates the attributes of substance from the modes of substance. The attributes can be thought of as the affections of substance. That is that which is in something else and is conceived through something else. The modes signify how one's intellect perceives the essence of substance. Hampshire neatly summarizes this, writing, substances are essentially things which originate change in accordance with the laws of their own nature. Interestingly, Spinoza's view on the attributes of substance is perhaps just as significant as his view on the nature of substance itself. He writes, in the universe, there cannot be two or more substances of the same nature or attribute, arguing that if there were, they could no longer be substances because they cannot exist in and of themselves, and one substance cannot be produced by another substance. Therefore, it must follow that attributes are unique to their substances. However, although many substances cannot share in the same attribute, many attributes can share in the same substance. He continues by arguing that every substance is necessarily infinite, and that since an absolutely infinite entity must necessarily be defined as an entity consisting of infinite attributes, it is therefore necessary that a substance must contain infinite attributes. As another British philosopher, Ruth Lydia Saw, explains, substance is not the abstract subject of qualities, but the concrete whole with its infinite modifications. And despite rejecting a number of traditional views from Christianity on substance, Spinoza nevertheless still believes in and argues for the existence of God. Ruth Lydia Saw briefly explains his view, writing, "For Spinoza, God, or infinite substance, is that which is known in careful thinking, so that he is himself the rational universe, the properties of which are developed into thinking." In Book 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza lays out his proofs for God's existence, which can be summarized as follows. A. There is nothing outside substance by which it could be produced. B. To suppose God's non-existence is to suppose that his essence does not involve existence. C. The reason for God's non-existence would have to lie either within his nature or without it. D. The inability to exist is impotence, as ability to exist is power. And he further argues that God, or substance, consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. If God did not exist, he continues, then his essence would necessarily not involve existence, which would contradict Spinoza's prior claim, which stated that the essence of a substance must necessarily involve existence. He writes, "There is nothing of which we can be more certain than the existence of an absolutely infinite or perfect entity, that is God. Therefore, God must exist. Furthermore, God is a substance, and since Spinoza argues that every substance is necessarily infinite, and absolutely infinite substances are necessarily indivisible, therefore God must necessarily be indivisible." Hampshire, commenting on this belief, writes, "This doctrine of infinite attributes immediately perplexed Spinoza's friends, and has perplexed all subsequent commentators, yet is certainly worth understanding, because from it are deduced some of the most lucid and practical of Spinoza's suggestions in psychology and ethics." Having laid out what he means by substance, and having proved the existence of God, Spinoza then makes what is perhaps his most unique and interesting claim, that there is, and there can be, only one substance, and that substance is God. Nothing else exists. It is this claim, and its logical entailment, which we will be looking at in the next part of this discussion. So make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss that. Thank you for watching.